1918. godine je od epidemije španjolske gripe u 2 godine umrlo 50 milijuna ljudi. 50 godina kasnije hongkonška gripa ubrala je manji danak, ali ipak milijun života. 30 godina kasnije navodno došlo je do epidemije ptiče gripe. Navodno, jer od nje umrlo oko 260 ljudi. Što ćete, ni epidemije više nisu kao što su bile. Slično je i s novim hitom, svinjskom gripom. Kao što kaže stara narodna pjesma, nismo je vidjeli, ali smo čuli glase. Ali među zborskim i ugođenim glasovima čuli smo i nekoliko koji su kvarili harmoniju. Kvarili su je informacijama. Jedan od tih glasova pripada austrijskoj novinarki, nekadašnjoj dopisnici Observera, Guardiana i British Health magazina. Jane Burgermeister nije ostala samo na glasu. U travnju 2009. godine je državnom tužiteljstvu u Beču podnijela kaznenu prijavu protiv tvrtke Baxter i drugih radi razvijanja, proizvodnje, oslobađanja i raspačavanja biološkog oružja za masovno uništenje. Pomoću uvođenja obveznog cijepljenja protiv lažne pandemije svinjske gripe, tvrdi ona, izazvat će se globalna pandemija ptiče gripe. Kako smatra da su te kompanije razvijale biokemijsko oružje u suradnji s takozvanim iluminatima ili grupom Bilderberg, Jane Burgermeister otišla je korak dalje. U kaznenoj prijavi FBI-u upozorila je na najveći zločin u povijesti čovječanstva. U prijavi je za urotu, bioterorizam i zločin protiv čovječanstva optužila Svjetsku zdravstvenu organizaciju, Ujedinjene narode, Baracka Obamu, njegovu državnu tajnicu za zdravstvo Kathleen Sebelius, kolegicu za domovinsku sigurnost Janet Napolitano, direktoricu Svjetske zdravstvene organizacije Margaret Chan i bankare Davida Rothschilda i Davida Rockefellera. Tko su ti ljudi koji žele prorijediti čovječanstvo prisiljavajući ljude na otrovno cijepljenje protiv izmišljenih pandemija? Zašto to čine i kako? Novinarka Jane Burgermeister sudu je podastrla dokaze za svoje tvrdnje. S njima je doletjela u Zagreb da ih razmotrimo i ovdje, na Rubu Znanosti. Sve vas pozdravljam. Ovo Jane Burgermeister, već ste čuli ponešto u uvodu emisije. Ostatak slijedi po putu, dok ćemo korak po korak pokušati osvijetliti što se to krije iza trenutno svjetski najvažnije vijesti, a to je navodna pandemija, navodne svinjske gripe. Dobar dan. Vratimo se nekoliko koraka unatrag. Kada je počela vaša istraga koja je rezultirala prvo kaznenom prijavom protiv tvrtke Baxter i drugih, a onda ćemo vidjeti kuda vas je to dovelo?
I started investigating in February of this year when I found out that a global bird flu pandemic had nearly been triggered. I found out by chance. I was shown, a neighbor came and showed me a report in a local paper saying that 36 people had to be treated for the bird flu preventatively in a hospital in Vienna and also in one in the Czech Republic. They had to be treated against this very dangerous disease because they had been handling material contaminated with the live bird flu virus that had been sent out by Baxter Pharmaceuticals. The material had been sent out from the facilities that Baxter has close to Vienna, and that's how I found that a global bird flu pandemic had nearly been triggered by the pharmaceutical company Baxter this February.
O kojim se količinama kontaminiranog materijala radilo?
We're talking about 72 kilos, which is an enormous amount of contaminated material, and this was manufactured in the facilities of Orton the Donau and sent to 16 laboratories via a laboratory called Aver Green Hills, close to where I live, and it was only detected by a person employed by the Czech laboratory of Biotest, who injected it into ferrets, and the ferrets apparently became very ill, and then they destroyed these ferrets and found out that the vaccine material was contaminated with the live bird flu virus. So we're talking about gigantic quantity of material contaminated with this virus.
Baxter je rekao da je riječ o pogrešci. Vi baš ne vjerujete u tu priču?
I certainly find it very difficult to believe because the bird flu virus is one of the most lethal there is, with a 60% mortality rate, and it is classified as a biosafety level 3 or 4 virus, and that means that pharmaceutical companies are required to handle it using extra precautions. For example, it has to be kept in a separate laboratory, it has to be kept people have to handle it with special clothing. There have to be double doors to kind of protect it from stray people walking in. Its whereabouts are tracked using codes, electronic codes. So extremely comprehensive safety measures have to be implemented when you're handling this kind of a virus. The other question is, why did Baxter have it in the first place? Who, the World Health Organization, gave Baxter this virus? But Baxter, in its facilities in Orthodona, just makes ordinary seasonal flu. It's not clear why they had this virus in the first place, how it came to contaminate 72 kilos of normal vaccine material, and how it managed to get undetected out of the facilities with the wrong label. So I believe it was deliberate, and I filed criminal charges because I believed it was deliberate. And the public prosecutor ordered and instructed the police to investigate because the evidence was quite strong that it was deliberate.
Koji je sadržaj kaznene prijave? Za što ste optužili Baxter?
I charge them with deliberately trying to start a pandemic and of also trying to profit from starting that pandemic, because Baxter in Austria has sealed contracts with the government to supply pandemic vaccinations in the event of a pandemic emergency. My initial charges were concerning, attempted mass murder and profit from that mass murder. Those were my first set of charges.
Pričamo o travnju 2009. godine. Da li ima nekih pomaka do danas?
I rang the public prosecutor today, and all I know is that the police in Korneuburg, which is where Baxter has its facilities, are still investigating this case. My understanding is that some of Baxter is very, very powerful indeed. Behind Baxter are very significant forces. I believe even President Obama has shares in Baxter, according to some sources. So to actually go and kind of arrest Baxter executives or something like that would be an extremely difficult thing for the Austrian police to do. I guess particularly because it seems like the health minister and the Chancellor of Austria, Werner Faymann, are involved in covering up what Baxter has done, and possibly even in promoting Baxter's activities. So a lot of political pressure seems to be being exercised on the police to not make any arrests or investigate too much.
Cijepiva i farmaceutska industrija inače imaju dugu i mračnu povijest. Međutim, stvar postaje još zanimljivija ako nam ispričate o vašoj sljedećoj kaznenoj prijavi koja daleko nadilazi austrijske okvire i kontaminirane materijale u samom Baxteru. Znači, pričamo o FBI-u. Možete nam ispričati sadržaj kaznene prijave FBI-u i što vas je na nju potaklo?
Sure. What happened was I'd barely filed this set of charges concerning the bird flu pandemic when just a few days later, I think I filed my charges on the 8th of April. I think about the 16th or 18th of April, the swine flu pandemic broke out in Mexico City, about 50 kilometers from a Baxter facility. President Obama was visiting Mexico City, and an archaeologist called Felipe Solis, who met him, died the next day from the swine flu. And within a few days, the World Health Organization announced that it was about to declare a pandemic level 6 emergency. And I knew that that meant that there could be forced vaccinations, forced quarantines in the USA and elsewhere. And then I filed a second set of charges alleging that this had been a deliberate attempt to start a pandemic by the same group of people, really, Baxter, the World Health Organization. And because there was evidence that President Obama was directly involved, that the swine flu appeared in Mexico City just coincidentally with his visit, and somebody he'd met had died the next day, I actually directly named him in those charges, as well as the other key figures who I believe are behind Baxter, whether you're talking about financial power, like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, or government officials who allow Baxter to proceed with its activities with impunity, like Kathleen Sebelius, the U.S. Health Secretary.
Druga kaznena prijava je predana FBI-u. Postoje pravne osnove za predavanje prijave FBI-u ako čovjek nije građanin Amerike?
Yes, I went to the Vienna embassy of the USA, and you can hand over charges to the FBI there. The laws are such that if a bioterrorism incident occurs that affects Americans, that the Americans have extraterritorial jurisdiction or something like that. So I don't think citizenship has anything to do with it. I was told they were put in the pipeline and they would be considered, but I have heard nothing from the FBI since.
Dokument koji ste predali zove se Dokazi o bioterorizmu. Što konkretno sadrži taj dokument, odnosno kako točno glasi kaznena prijava FBI-u?
Well, the document contains evidence that firstly this swine flu virus was deliberately released, that it's a lab-engineered virus. The World Health Organization itself has more or less admitted that when it said that it shouldn't be called the swine flu because it has nothing to do with pigs, although it's supposed to have originated among pigs. It's the H1N1 virus. So the document looks at the fact this is a lab-engineered virus. It also looks at the who profits politically and financially from the declaration of a pandemic, and this is the World Health Organization. Because it acquires enormous powers over countries like the USA and also the individual countries in Europe in the event it declares a pandemic level 6 emergency, powers over the health services and the military police. And it looks at the pharmaceutical companies, how they profit financially, and it simply lists all the evidence of how these people work together to trigger a pandemic and then profit from it financially and politically by implementing various forced vaccination programs and martial law.
Možemo li reći da svinjska gripa predstavlja pravu opasnost ili ne? S obzirom da su u javnosti dostupne vrlo kontradiktorne informacije, dok se vlade pripremaju sa velikim investicijama za kupnje cjepiva, u isto vrijeme neki drugi predstavnici tih vlada, neinformirani ili neučeni, navode podatke da simptomi nisu prepoznatljivi, ne može se odvojiti od obične gripe, svinjska gripa, da ju se može prehodati, da zapravo riječ o bolesti koja uopće ne postoji.
Yes, I think that it is absolutely ridiculous that a pandemic should be declared over what is a very, very mild disease. The World Health Organization itself, according to its official figures, has said only 5,000 people have died from it, and 500,000 people, according to the World Health Organization, die every year from the normal flu. In order to declare a pandemic, in fact, the World Health Organization had to change the criteria from mortality and lethality to spread. That's the only way they could manage to declare a pandemic over such an incredibly mild and harmless disease as the swine flu is. So it's clearly a political goal that the World Health Organization is trying to accomplish with this pandemic declaration. It has nothing to do with protecting the public health because there's no threat to the public health from this swine flu.
Postoje ljudi koji su zaključili da ako virus nije opasnost, a inzistira se na cjepivu, da mora biti da se onda u cjepivu krije pravi problem. Koji je zapravo sadržaj cjepiva koje je, eto, trenutno najtraženija roba na svijetu?
Well, you're absolutely right. In my view, the vaccine is a bioweapon. It is actually classified as a bioweapon. If you look in the biopharma databases, and you see the regulatory status of GSK's Pandemrix and Novartis's Fossatria, you can see that they're classified as biodefense stockpile drugs, and they have to be distributed by the army, by the government, because they're so dangerous. And the ingredients are also very troubling. They contain mercury and they contain squalene. And squalene is an adjuvant which is considered to be responsible for causing the Gulf War syndrome. 25% of the US and UK veterans who took anthrax vaccines with squalene during the Gulf War acquired autoimmune diseases and other serious afflictions because of the squalene, and this vaccine has 1 million times more of it than that vaccine. This is a completely new vaccine that has not been properly tested, and the pharmaceutical companies have complete immunity. So no matter how many people they kill or damage through this vaccine, they cannot be prosecuted.
Svjetska zdravstvena organizacija inzistira na tome da u cjepivu bude i živi virus. Što mislite, zbog čega je to i ima li to kakav značaj?
I personally, think that this is because the World Health Organization is trying to infect people with a disease, and you need a live virus in order to, infect them with the disease. So I think they argue this is supposed to produce antibodies or whatever, but it would be a precondition of actually giving people a disease through this vaccination. In polio, in Nigeria recently, the World Health Organization carried out a vaccination campaign against polio and gave children the polio through the live viruses in the vaccines. That's how they triggered a polio pandemic in Nigeria.
Može li se uopće pričati o simptomima svinjske gripe? Evo, osobno sam na radiju čuo vijesti koje po prilici idu ovako. U Hrvatskoj umrla prva žrtva od svinjske gripe. U sljedećoj rečenici rečeno je sad se mora napraviti istraživanje je li ta osoba umrla od svinjske gripe ili ne, što je naravno poprilično neobična rečenica ako je u prvoj rečenici konstatirano da jest. Pa onda se često puta nalaze informacije o simptomima iz kojih se može ispostaviti da simptoma skoro nema. Potom se može naći na informaciju da su ustanovljeni telefoni pomoću kojih se dijagnosticira je li neko bolestan. To po prilici izgleda tako da neko nazove i kaže oprostite, kašljem malo, a s druge strane neki mladić sa uputama mu može reći da, vi imate svinjsku gripu i tako statistički dobivamo sve veće brojeve oboljih od svinjske gripe. Mada možda i nisu takvi. Između simptoma i statistike, kakva je tu veza i jesu li svi oboljeli od svinjske gripe? Zaista oboljeli od nje?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the USA has said that the swine flu symptoms are more or less identical with the normal flu symptoms. So if you have any of the normal flu symptoms like fever, coughing, congestion, you have the swine flu according to the CDC. And most of the rapid diagnosis tests for the swine flu have proved to be inaccurate. So 9 times out of 10 when they diagnose the swine flu, it actually turns out to be the normal seasonal flu. My view is that maybe there is a swine flu, maybe there isn't, but in most cases people actually just have the normal flu, and the government see a political advantage in claiming this is the swine flu and hyping this pandemic.
Na koji način su farmaceutske tvrtke oslobođene odgovornosti od posljedica cijepljenja? Odnosno od posljedica koje njihova cjepiva mogu napraviti?
Well, special decrees have been passed in every single country, including the USA and in the EU, which give the pharmaceutical companies blanket immunity from any prosecution, and this is something completely new. These are special government decrees that have been made. There's a secret contract with the French government which says that no matter what vaccines Baxter delivers to France, no matter what's in them, no matter how damaging they are, they cannot be prosecuted under any account. So this is blanket immunity they've been given by governments.
Kada je zapravo patentirano cjepivo protiv svinjske gripe? S obzirom da su se mogle u medijima čuti rečenice poput ubrzano radimo na razvijanju cjepiva, da bi se potom ustanovilo da su tvrtke neke patentirale cjepivo još prije nego što se svinjska gripa pojavila. Da li tu postoje nekakvi tragovi, možda su oni čak i dio vaših dokumenata?
Yes, Baxter filed a patent for the swine flu vaccine in 2008, and I think Novartis and GSK in 2006, and they filed patents for model mock-up vaccines. which had the H1N1 virus in it. The problem is that the World Health Organization declared in April that this virus is completely new. That's how they justified declaring their pandemic. It can only be declared if they say a completely new influenza virus has appeared. And so it doesn't quite add up how the virus can be so new on the one hand in April 2009, and on the other hand, Baxter, Novartis and GSK have filed patents for the vaccines a couple of years before.
Nameće se zaključak, a to i vi spominjete u vašim kaznenim prijavama, a vidimo i stvari koje vode u tom smjeru, da je riječ o nekakvom planu za obvezno cijepljenje svih ljudi. To kod nas nije toliko izraženo, u Americi malo više. Općenito Svjetska zdravstvena organizacija uvijek daje neke preporuke, što zvuči blago. Međutim, naravno, odluke Svjetske zdravstvene organizacije su obvezujuće za njenih gotovo 200 zemalja članica. Kad se jednom proglasi pandemija, kao što jest proglašena, to znači da oni zapravo mogu odrediti da li cjepivo obavezno ili nije. Kako se razvija taj plan o obaveznom cijepljenju? Kako se razvija u različitim zemljama? Gdje se provodi, gdje je bliže cilju, gdje je još daleko od toga?
Well, we can see how it works now in the Ukraine, not very far from Croatia. And just last week, plague was reported, which allegedly killed a lot of people. And within a very short space of time, the president of the Ukraine, Viktor Yushchenko, said this is a national emergency. He was going to implement special measures to deal with it and suspend elections or postpone elections or whatever, and put quarantines around large regions. And he also said he was going to prepare to vaccinate the entire population. So within the Ukraine, there have been laws put in place which allow this kind of forced vaccination, forced quarantine to take place. And these laws have been put in place by the World Health Organization, and they are actually the International Health Regulations 2005 that are now being implemented in the Ukraine. A crisis committee has been set up, and this takes over control of key government functions in the Ukraine, also the police and the health services. So that's how easily it can happen. They just have to find an excuse to declare there's a big pandemic, and then they can start implementing all this legislation, which is on the books anyway. The same is true of the USA. A couple of weeks ago, President Obama declared a national emergency over the swine flu pandemic, and by doing this, he activated certain laws which will also enable the federal government and states to implement forced vaccination and forced quarantine eventually, if they think they can get away with it.
Što ti zakoni doista omogućuju? Kako u Americi, tako i u Engleskoj i u Francuskoj. Riječ je o mjerama koje na prvi pogled zvuče kao mjere policijske države, možda i na drugi. Znači, stanovništvo se može cijepiti bez vlastite želje, može se ulaziti u privatne posjede, uhititi svakoga tko ne želi se cijepiti. Kazne od $1,000 se spominju. Čak se ide u ekstreme, pa se spominje da čovjek neće moći dignuti svoj novac u banci ako nema potvrdu da je cijepljen. Je li to sve točno? Postoje li takvi primjeri? Ja sam ih skupio dosta po internetu. Neki se tiču nekih država, američkih kao Massachusetts, neke se tiču evropskih država, poput Francuske. Dajte nam nekoliko primjera u kom smjeru i kako to ide negdje drugdje.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned Massachusetts, which has particularly draconian laws. Under the Massachusetts pandemic emergency declaration, the police can force vaccinate children. They can go into people's homes, and they can even burn homes and quarantine whole towns. They can send people to FEMA camps, I suppose, on the grounds that they could be infected with the swine flu. And people can be put in this quarantine indefinitely without access to the outside world. So basically, it's incredibly drastic measures that are in place, as well as enormous fines, I think. France is also kind of planning a situation where France ends up divided into military zones and coming under the control of army officials in the event of a pandemic emergency who can suspend basic civic rights. The Minister of Justice has said people can be kept in prison for 6 months without trial in the event of a pandemic emergency. Children can be put on trial in adults' courts. So wherever you look, whether it's the USA, examples like Massachusetts, or whether it's Europe and France or whatever, you see that the pandemic is being used as an excuse to deprive people of their most basic civic rights. Yes.
Kada pričamo o posljedicama cjepiva, inače na vašem sajtu Swine Flu postoji ogromna količina tekstova i članaka koje svaki dan obnavljate i updatirate. Da li se može govoriti da su se već dogodile neke smrti koje su posljedica cjepiva, s obzirom da također postoje nekakve indicije da takva cjepiva koja rade u 3 koraka zapravo ne donose smrt odmah? U prvom koraku, ako sam dobro shvatio, se imunološki sustav ugasi, u drugom se cjepivo ubrizga, u trećem onda imunološki sustav svojom pretjeranom reakcijom zapravo ubija čovjeka, jer ne bi baš bilo jako efikasno cijepiti ljude dok drugi okolo umiru. Međutim, da li prema vašim podacima postoje već neke smrti od cijepiva dokumentirane?
Yes, if we look at Sweden, at least 5 people have been reported to have died shortly after they took the swine flu shot by the mainstream media alone. And 160, I think, nurses had severe reactions in Sweden. And those are just the cases that were reported in the mainstream media. Bear in mind, the Swedish government doesn't require doctors to report deaths or damage caused by the swine flu. We also don't know how many people in Sweden have actually taken the swine flu shot, because the government only reports how many doses have been distributed, which is 1.4 million. There's no figures about how many people have actually taken the shot. So we can see in Sweden people who have died as a result of this jab already. You were referring at first to the WHO memos of 1972, which were uncovered by Patrick Jordan and Dr. Rebecca Carley in the USA. And they found that the World Health Organization, even back then, was thinking of using vaccines to kill people, and had developed a method which we now can see being realized in the swine flu vaccine, as you just described it.
Da li je bilo primjera svinjske gripe u nedavnoj prošlosti, prije 20, 30, 50, 80 godina? Postoje nekakve čak i teorije da je poznata gripa iz 1918. u stvari poslužila kao predložak za virus o kojem se danas toliko priča, i o cjepivu.
That's what I understand too. I understand that Jeffrey Taubenberger, a US scientist who works for the Army Institute of Pathology in Maryland, went and dug up the corpse of a victim of the Spanish pandemic flu. And this victim was preserved in the permafrost of Alaska, and he and his team extracted the genetic material, took it back to their lab, and began trying to reconstruct it. And every time they successfully took a step towards reconstructing this virulent virus, they actually published the results in scientific journals. So, and that's how they reconstructed the H1N1 virus, and also the bird flu virus is an artificial lab-engineered virus. There's another case of French professor Bruno Lina, who has gone on record in the French media this summer as saying he's looking for a more virulent gene for the swine flu virus in his laboratory in Lyon. So there are plenty of these researchers and scientists working on making these viruses more and more virulent and turning them into really deadly weapons.
Možete li nam možda još jednom detaljnije objasniti što zapravo cjepivo protiv svinjske gripe u sebi sadrži? Koje sve viruse ili nešto što bi moglo djelovati pogubno?
Well, in theory it's supposed to contain the swine flu virus, whatever that might be, but the problem is that basically WHO can, and the pharmaceutical companies can put any virus into this vaccine. What we have found is that there are no controls at all on this vaccine. The Polish health minister herself said recently, we don't know what's in this vaccine. Anything could be in it because it's kept secret under commercial secrets. The companies themselves admit that mercury is in it, and mercury has caused autism in children, and squalene is in it, and a live virus is in it. though we can't be sure really what live virus is in it. The secret contract that the French government sealed with Baxter was eventually published just a couple of weeks ago, and it turned out that Baxter had a contract to supply 150 vaccines for meningitis in the event of a pandemic. So there could even be meningitis viruses causing damage to the brain in these vaccines.
Dobro, kod raznih istraživača se mogu naći razne kombinacije, razne mogućnosti, šta je sve umiješano. Vratimo se na tužbu FBI-u protiv određene skupine ljudi, institucija. Ljudi unutra naizgled se čine ne toliko povezani kad čitamo novine. Barack Obama je naravno predsjednik, David Nabarro je sistemski koordinator za gripu, Margaret Chan je generalna direktorica Svjetske zdravstvene organizacije, Kathleen Sebelius je ministrica zdravstva, Janet Napolitano je ministrica domovinske sigurnosti, naravno Rothschild je bankar, David Rockefeller također je bankar. Ta grupa ljudi koja djeluje organizirano, očito je ovdje pravo mjesto da se upotrebi jedna riječ koja se često, nažalost, izgubila u različitim čudnovatim pričama, a to je riječ urota. Mislite li da ovi ljudi djeluju sinkronizirano, da su dio neke šire urote, i ako da, koje? S obzirom da očito ne smjera taj plan ništa dobro čovječanstvu ako je suriti po svinjskoj gripi.
Yes, I sure believe that these people have been working in a coordinated and synchronized way to trigger a pandemic and then declare a pandemic emergency. This is whose role. And then to implement these forced vaccination programs. And they have done this at a point in time when we're facing one of the biggest economic crises for decades. And this has been artificially engineered by banks in order to increase their share of power and money or whatever. And the same banks which have engineered this crisis or have played a key role in it are also financiers of the pharma companies, and central or key families like the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds are involved not only in the banks and the pharma companies, they also play leading roles in governments like J. Rockefeller, who passed Senate Bill 666 in 2003, which channeled money from the US government into developing bioweapons by private companies. And they also, the Rockefellers, have funded and donated land and sums of money to the UN. And the Rothschilds have given substantial sums of money to the World Health Organization. So if we look a little bit behind the surface, we can see these people are very much connected, and they are all moving together to accomplish the same agenda, which is to rob people through this economic crisis and then murder them through this forced vaccination program, in my view.
Koji bi bio krajnji cilj djelovanja te skupine ljudi koju nekad zovu iluminatima, nekad ih se poistovjećuje s nekim skupinama koji su stvari samo dio šire mreže, kao što je recimo grupa Bilderberg i slično? Koji je njihov krajnji cilj? Novca očito imaju već puno. Kontrole, naravno kontrole nikad dosta, ali i nje imaju dosta. Vaše osobno mišljenje koje ne mora biti potkrepljeno nekakvim podacima. O čemu se tu radi?
Well, if you look at what is happening at the moment, you have to conclude that their aim is to set up a one world government. Because if a pandemic emergency is declared, the World Health Organization can take control of every single government within Europe and the USA, 194 governments or countries, I think. It takes control of the health services, of the police and the military. And this means that the structure has been created basically for a one world government. At the same time, we see the UN, through the Copenhagen Treaty, is taking control of people's economy under the pretext of fighting global warming and having to control carbon emissions. They have acquired enormous power over every single economy. So if you put the UN and the World Health Organization together, you have a one world government with two arms operating. Interestingly enough, this making the World Health Organization a global health department was discussed at the Bilderberg meeting in Athens this year by Carl Bildt, the ex-Prime Minister of Sweden. So we have witnesses who have heard that these very powerful people meeting in secret are thinking along the lines of turning the World Health Organization into this huge global overreaching body controlling countries around the world.
S obzirom na razmjere ovih događaja o kojima pričamo, jesu li pretjerane tvrdnje da je moguće u cjepiva, poput ovog koje se namjerava napraviti obaveznim, staviti nekakve vrsti mikročipova i slično, s obzirom da oni danas već mogu biti doista vrlo mali? I ako da će biti mikročipovi trebali služiti, s obzirom da se i o tome može naći podataka kad se prati priča o svinjskoj gripi?
Well, incredible as it sounds, there is hard evidence that these vaccines could contain a microchip. I understand one of the major microchip manufacturers, Verichip, has got contracts with all of the 5 big pharma companies. These microchips are believed to be going to be in the government controlled syringes. You can't use, or doctors or hospitals can't use just any syringe for this swine flu. They have to use special syringes supplied by the government, and these syringes have a certain batch number, and when somebody is given a vaccine with this batch number, it is linked to their social security number and put into a huge database, and this database has been built up by the World Health Organization now for the past 2-3 years, and the basis of the database has been the information on people's health or social security and health records in every single country. So there's plenty of credible evidence that there is going to be a microchip in the vaccines. And the odd thing about the this pandemic is that every single government, including the US government, has said it wants to vaccinate 100% of the population. And this is a goal stated in every single country's pandemic plans. And it's very difficult to understand why they want 100% coverage unless they intend to get this nanochip into everybody. If they get the nanochip into everybody, they can, in theory, I think, track and control everybody who's alive in Europe and the USA or whoever has taken this vaccination and keep them under control.
Možda čak i utjecati na njihovo raspoloženje i mentalno stanje, s obzirom da čip radi dvosmjerno.
That's, as far as I understand, is the case. Somebody I spoke to had discussed this with a biophysicist, and they said that if we have toxic metals or heavy metals like mercury and aluminium in our body, that these interact with electromagnetic waves, and if somebody beams electromagnetic waves with certain frequency at us, they can stimulate certain emotions, depression, anxiety, aggression, joy, or whatever, but they need a sort of, a beamer to target these waves too. And this would be, for example, the nanochip. That would be one way these people could use the nanochip to induce in individuals or even in whole peoples mass hysteria, mass anger, aggression, whatever emotion they wished, using this interaction of all these elements.
Prije svega mislimo na one sretnike koji će preživjeti cjepivo, zar ne?
That's right. I mean, I think they themselves are not quite sure how many people they are going to be able to kill with this vaccine. I think that they are particularly targeting children, and they are targeting particularly women who are expecting children. The vaccine has not been tested on these two groups. There is no clinical data on them. The clinical trials on pregnant women began last month only in September, and they're not due to be finished till 2010. And the trials on children also only began last September and are not due to be finished until long after the vaccination is completed. And I believe this is because they know very well that these are especially dangerous vaccines for children and for pregnant women. So I think they're aiming to damage and destroy the next generation very significantly through these vaccinations. And then a lot of people will have autoimmune diseases or reactions months after getting these vaccines, even if they don't drop dead immediately, as the US and UK soldiers did. Others will drop dead immediately. And by vaccinating people, there's also the option of putting in a live virus, like a live bird flu virus, and thereby triggering a pandemic, which could then kill more people. I think these group, this international corporate crime syndicate, as I've called it, have planned many different ways to reduce the world's population, and that includes wars, famine, and GMO foods, the Codex Alimentarius. They realize that their target is very ambitious. They want to kill more than 6 billion, according to some sources. And so they have thought of many, many different measures to do it. But the vaccination and the pandemic will play a significant role, I think, in their view, in damaging and killing people, and also provide them with the capacity to create this one world government on the shattered ruins of national government states.
Kakve su reakcije ljudi i javnosti? Da li oni prihvaćaju ideju o cijepljenju protiv svinjske gripe ili ne? Naime, pretpostavljam da su u svakoj zemlji novine pune dnevnih vijesti iz aktualne politike koje zaokupljaju ljude, pa se takve vijesti nalaze dosta razbacane. Međutim, na vašem web sajtu ih skupljate svakoga dana. Vijesti stižu iz Poljske, iz Finske, iz Amerike. Riječ je nekad o liječnicima, nekad je riječ o ljudima koji naravno nisu liječnici. Kakva je percepcija javnosti prema tom cjepivu? Da li ga ljudi prihvaćaju, odbijaju?
Well, the more information people get about the dangers of this vaccine and how it hasn't been subjected to proper trials, the more polls show that they are rejecting this vaccine. And there's been a dramatic drop in the number of people willing to take this vaccine in, for example, Germany and even France. In Germany it was, I think, something like 55% just a couple of months ago, and now it's only 13%. And I think in France it was also, and it's something like 57%, and now it's 17% in a very short time. In Germany, the whole discussion about what is in the swine flu vaccine was triggered by the decision of the German army not to take the vaccine because they considered it too toxic for their own soldiers. And this unleashed a tremendous debate about what is this vaccine? Is it really necessary when the swine flu is so mild? And it resulted in many articles in the mainstream media being very critical of the swine flu vaccine. And the news spread, people became informed, and they realized that it's a tremendous risk taking this vaccine. It's not tested, it's full of toxins. If there is a virus, there are much better ways of protecting yourself, like surgical masks or vitamins or colloidal silver or MMS. So the trend throughout Europe is for people to increasingly reject this vaccination. And now the Polish health minister has said she is not intending yet to even buy these vaccines for the Polish people. She is a family doctor, and she's looked into the clinical tests, and she said they're inadequate. She can't guarantee the safety of these vaccines. She wouldn't be sure she'd give them to her own children and grandmother. And so she herself has even said that these are unsafe or at least untested vaccinations and very risky. And she was supported by the Polish Prime Minister. So we see resistance increasing everywhere.
Podaci koji su dostupni, poput recimo toga da su Portugalci se bunili protiv primanja cijepiva, pa 75% Finaca ga je odbilo primiti, pa su se, u Poljskoj se to čak diglo na jedan malo viši nivo. Pretpostavljam da su prvi na toj listi, na tom popisu bili i zdravstveni radnici. Spomenuto da je 90% zdravstvenih radnika u Grčkoj također odbilo se cijepiti. Što kažu liječnici i sestre koji bi trebali davati cijepivo na to cijepivo, da li ga sami uzimaju, da li snose kakve posljedice ako ga ne žele davati?
Well, the doctors and the nurses have been among the fiercest critics of this vaccine, and the majority in almost every country has said that they don't want to take this vaccine. They were the priority target group for the first vaccinations, and the turnout was very, very low. I know for a fact, for example, in Vienna, only 100 of the 32,000 health workers in the city took the vaccine in the first week. So that's how low it is. I think it's less than 0.1%. And comparable figures in other parts of Austria, in Germany. In France, I think maybe 10% took it in one hospital in Paris, according to the French health minister. But other hospitals report minuscule numbers of nurses being willing to take this vaccine, even though they're put under tremendous pressure. There was a case in Austria where nurses and doctors were told they'd be fired if they didn't take the vaccine, and they still said we're not taking the vaccine, and refused to take it. So nurses and doctors are not taking this vaccine.
Pričali smo do sada o svinjskom gripu i cijepivu svjetskoj uroti, međutim možemo ovih zadnjih par minuta posvetiti vama osobno, s obzirom da se bavite jednom stvari koja će nekim ljudima zvučati prefantastično, nekima drugima preopasno. Kako je na vaš osobni život i da li je utjecalo razotkrivanje priče o cijepivu protiv navodne svinjske gripe?
Well, I have to say it's been one new discovery after another. I think like many people, I would not have believed that there was a group of people who are so organized, who have so control of so many key government functions in so many countries, who are working together to give people this toxic and untested vaccine, and who want to damage and kill millions, if not billions of people. So it's been very difficult to understand that this is really what is happening. As somebody who has worked as a journalist, I realize that the media is systematically filtered in the Western Europe. I saw how my reports were censored. So I was aware there was a very powerful group of people behind the media screen who were controlling our perception of events and who were feeding us information that enabled them to increase their power, their money, and I knew they were unscrupulous and they were whatever. But I would never have believed that there were people out there who would have planned and intended such a terrible crime against their fellow human beings, and that these are in Austria, our chancellor, our health minister, the key officials, who we see on TV every day and who are signing these decrees and covering up these events and planning these terrible crimes. So I've been in a state of personal shock, to be honest, about what's been going on.
Evo, taj osobni šok je završio time da se danas uglavnom bavite svojim web sajtom kojim pratite zbivanje oko svinjske gripe.
Well, I was fired from my job as a result of my filing the charges. And at that point, I did think the priority is to try and communicate to people the danger of these vaccines. I knew I couldn't get this information out through the mainstream media. And so I set up a website with Johan Nicolason. And we report on these developments to try and keep people up to date. I believe we are entering a critical period of time. These people do want to turn the swine flu into a bird flu. They want to introduce pneumonic plagues such as the Ukraine, and they want to use this as an excuse to implement martial law wherever they can. I think it's becoming more and more difficult for them, but they're going to try it. And so it's very, very important at this point to mobilize as many people as possible and make them aware that they have to be alert and be ready to defend their basic rights in case the government does try something like this.
Jane, hvala vam što ste došli iz Beča u Hrvatsku. Nije to ni tako daleko.
Thank you very much for having me.
I želim vam puno sreće u vašem radu. Da ne kažem, želim nam puno sreće u vašem radu.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hvala i vama na pažnji i dobro došli u novi svjetski poredak, ako mogu tako reći. Čini se da će biti manje gužve na cestama, ali dok taj pokušaj ne propadne, držat ćemo se provjerenog starog poretka stvari, a to je onaj kod kojeg tjedan ima 7 dana, a mi se vidimo svakog prvog dana u tjednu. Čuvajte sami svoje zdravlje na način kako je to priroda zamislila i doviđenja.